All right, so realizing that I'm the last thing standing between everybody and the last of a beautiful day. And chainsaw, that's right. I forgot there was a chainsaw, right. Okay, so we'll get rolling. So I'm Kari Easthouse. Shawn McGrath is actually in Fredericton. He couldn't join us physically today. Hopefully, if the technology works, he's going to pop on here at some point. So, yeah, it's what I guess first comment, it was, I kind of went on sabbatical, let's call it, for 5 or 6 years. I haven't been to one of these in a while. Used to be a regular at these things. It's quite a number of people here today, which is really great to see, and new faces, which is pretty awesome. So, probably about 10 or 12 years ago, Peter Burchell and Bill Hill and I went over to BEI to look at an operation over there. It was ACFOR. So they were doing something pretty neat. They weren't selling wood, they were selling energy. They were selling heat to hospitals and a couple other locations. And because they were in the energy business, not the wood selling business, they were actually doing fairly well financially and able to cover the cost of doing some really good restoration type cuts. So the wood coming from the forest was coming from silviculture operations, restoration type operations, going to these facilities that they actually own the facilities and selling the heat, and it was a really neat, complete cycle. Since then, I've gone off and done some things, they've done things and so on, and then in the fall, I had my third midlife crisis, and maybe it's a late life crisis at this point, and quit my job and started my career over again. And at that point, so I've known Shawn for quite a while. We got together and started talking about things and decided to work on a couple projects here in Nova Scotia. One of them, sort of at a broader level, is how can we take that model and do something similar here in Nova Scotia, and then a more specific one around traceability of biomass supply. So what that means is, if I'm purchasing biomass and I'm producing heat in a facility exactly like this one, how can I be sure that where it came from was sustainably produced? How can we track it through so that we can guarantee people that the energy they're buying it was secured appropriately. So that's sort of the project. That's what I'm going to talk about a little bit later. Hopefully, is Shawn?
Yeah.
He's up. Okay, so here's how it's going to work. I'm going to hand it over to Shawn here for a while. So he's the biomass and the business guy. He's going to talk around that part of this. Then he's going to kick it back to me. I'm going to talk around some of like dashboardy numbers, more of the technical side of how we're pulling this together, and then at the end we'll kind of wrap it up with our thoughts on what this might look like in Nova Scotia, what the opportunities are, and that type of thing. So, can we kick it over to Shawn?
Yeah, do you want him in front of the PowerPoint there?
Yes, let's do that. So Shawn, I'll click the screen to move things forward. Can you see what's going on?
Can everyone hear me?
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
You're back, go for it.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I had you on my laptop a second ago, and Teams usually always works, except for, I guess, when I'm in front of trying to make it work for a room of 50 people or so. So I pivoted to my cell phone. Hopefully that you guys can hear me all right. So maybe if you could flip to the next slide.
Trying. Should I be pointing to something? Look at this, I'm about to talk about technology and I can't do this. Okay.
Yeah, so Kari, as Kari said, we came together to work around, I guess, biomass, ecological forest management, and technology. And so when we were asked to come speak today, they left it pretty open, what we talked about. So we're trying to give a little bit of general information about biomass and then lead into talking about ourselves, because they didn't tell us we couldn't. So we'll talk about the ACFOR model and how we approach biomass, some risks and opportunities of developing new biomass, energy, that is, tracking and traceability. We have an active pilot running and another pilot starting with biomass tracking and traceability. And then maybe discuss a bit about the opportunity for woodlot owners.
Okay, I'm trying to advance.
Yeah, that's because we got too many things on the.
Oh, okay, Andrew's going to advance.
Okay, awesome.
Here we go.
Okay, so for the purpose of today, there's lots of different ways to use biomass, even different ways to use biomass for energy than I'm talking about today, but I'll focus on, when I'm talking about biomass energy, I'm kind of focused on what's currently actively running in the province. And so you have heat only, so facilities that only make heat for consumption, electricity only, and then combined heat and power. And you often hear people calling those CHP. The heat only facilities, they're relatively simple to operate. The technology's mature and relatively efficient, like usually north of 85% and between 85 and 95% range. And it's usually deployed on either single buildings or small district energy systems, clusters of buildings. It's the operation's relatively simple. Like all of ours are run autonomously, so we monitor them remotely, but there's no one on site to run them. And two examples of ones that are of that version that are in Nova Scotia is. I guess they're not quite running yet, but there's a new facility at the Cape Breton Regional and a second facility actually nearby in North Sydney, also going to be operated by Nova Scotia Health. And then the one in the picture is NSCC Lunenburg, and that's owned by ACFOR, and we heat the community college and on a district loop there. The electricity only. People aren't really developing these because they're relatively inefficient. Anytime you're producing electricity, unless you're a huge electrical consumer, they require a grid connection and also an agreement with the utility or the grid to buy the electricity from you, which can be kind of a really complex, often political process to make that happen. The last ones that were really created were during the Confed days, where there was like an open offer for community produced electricity. Generally, anything biomass producing electricity is pretty high cost, and they generally have to be large scale in order to make sense. And they have large operating costs as well, because those need to be staffed, so they can't run autonomously. Like ours do. And I should say heat-only ones sometimes need to be staffed as well with their high-pressure steam. Our facility is low-pressure hot water. And so an example of that is Brooklyn Power. And a caveat there is Brooklyn Power used to provide its heat to a pulp mill, but just the pulp mill no longer exists. So it only sells its electricity and dumps its heat now. Then combined heat power. So the most complex to develop and operate. Again, the technology is mature and efficient. There's tons of these around the world running. Again, requires a grid connection, so that can be a complex administrative hurdle. Requires heat distribution, and so that's a big thing. Is when you're developing a combined heat power, you need for it to be efficient and use the heat, because usually these produce heat at about 70%. And 30% of its electricity. And so if you can't find large consumers, then the CHP generally doesn't work, because you can always unload the electricity, but you can't find a home for the heat most oftentimes. And so that's why you find them beside sawmills or pulp mills, because they have a big heat demand. They're high capital cost, and high operating costs, but they have two revenue streams. So they're selling heat and electricity, so generally so that the economics can still make sense. An example of those, a smaller one, is the Dal AC campus, which was fairly recently installed, and then a much larger facility, the Point Tucker facility, beside PHP. You can go to the next slide.
Yep.
So, ACFOR got in the energy business actually shortly after we opened up our doors to do restorative ecological forestry. In 2008, we bought small thinning harvesters to implement our ecological forestry. And ACFOR stands for Acadian Forest. We're trying to restore the Acadian Forest, and doing so through light thinning entries and favoring the Acadian forest species and using light to regenerate Acadian forest species. And we quickly found out likely one of the biggest bottlenecks to do that is being able to sell the low-grade wood that's produced, because we're generally protecting and leaving the higher value trees to grow, and then taking out a lot of dead or misformed or undesirable trees to give space or encourage new trees to grow. And so instead of just calling it quits, we decided to purchase a bunch more expensive equipment to try and get our way out of it through biomass energy facilities and PEI. And so essentially our model is we work with private woodlot owners and contractors, and sometimes the contractor, the forest machinery is machinery we own, and sometimes it's machinery owned by others, so long as they'll follow the treatments that the landowner and our planners have come up with, and we'll produce a number of products. We'll always sell sawable products into sawable markets, the highest value market, and then whatever can't be sold into the market, we'll make biomass out of it. And so that's generally very small, like after the stud's been made, then there's a little bit left. We'll take down to like a 2-inch, and we'll leave all the limbs and tops in the forest to decompose. And we'll let it sit and dry at the roadside for about a year. We're trying to get it sub 30% moisture in most cases. We'll chip it and take it to the energy facility. And our goal is to be able to get as much of the value from that renewable energy sale back into the forest. So we're trying to keep our supply chain pretty lean and pretty direct so that we can use as much of that renewable energy revenue to make these treatments feasible. Go to the next one. So when we got started, our first installs, we did about 10 facilities, heating schools and hospitals in Prince Edward Island. And that was about 5 megawatts of capacity, ranging from 220 kilowatt to 2.3 megawatts. So you can picture either just like one school would be a small school would be 220 kilowatt, and then the 2.3 megawatt was the Prince County Hospital in a manor that was beside it. So we ran a district system there. And they collectively were consuming about 7,500 green metric tons of chips a year. And then one of our most recent projects, went up in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia. It's heating the NSCC campus and a couple of provincial buildings there. And that's a 500 kilowatt boiler. It displaces about 179,000 liters of fossil fuel a year. And that's about 342 tons of CO2 avoided if you take the fossil fuel emissions and then take the amount of emissions in the handling of the chips. And so equivalent to about 105 passenger vehicles a year. And that we treat about 17 hectares of forests a year. And so that's generally doing like 30 to 40% removals. And then whatever doesn't make saw material we'll take as biomass. And we don't do any of the actual harvesting in Western Nova Scotia. That we work with Western Woodlot Services Co-op and a couple of key contractors and folks there to make that project happen. You can see the polygon or the shape beside the campus there, that's 17 hectares to give you an idea, although we're not planning on cutting that down on polish. You can go to the next one. So some of the risks and opportunities I think worth pointing out with biomass development, it could contribute to forest degradation. Currently, there's no real mechanism to stop it. So whatever laws apply are the laws you have to follow. So long as you're not interfering with water courses or whatever, you can do whatever you want. Or the fuel can be produced through whatever means, so long as you're not breaking the law. Which is a bit problematic because a lot of these projects are financed because of their climate, as a climate solution. And so a big argument is that, well, you're financing these for decarbonization through decarbonization funds, but then you're degrading the forest's ability to sequester carbon, and so that can be a big problem. A lot of times we'll see facilities because they're not really, the modern biomass facilities aren't built here, nor are there a lot of them. And so sometimes we see them installed improperly or operated improperly. This is happening in Quebec. There was a whole bunch of installs, and they were basically sold by biomass equipment salespeople, and then they just kind of installed them and left, and a lot of them aren't operating. So we've seen that a little bit. So it's important to know to work with trusted developers. There's a public distaste, and so I think the public has some legitimate concerns and some maybe unfounded concerns in some cases. I think it's a thing about education and trust. And so I think that trust isn't there in all cases, and then the knowledge isn't shared properly. The fuel quality is huge. So if the fuel quality doesn't match what the biomass can consume, then it really won't run efficiently, or it will stop all the time, requiring a lot of extra operating costs, which can kind of ruin the feasibility of the facility. The supply generally, it's not like a one-stop shop like you call up an oil truck like Irving Oil and they deliver. There's not always that same sort of established supply chain, so it's coming from woodlots all over. That can also be a benefit because you have tons of sources all around these facilities, but you have to make sure that you have somebody that can manage that supply chain, both to bring together that disaggregated supply and to make sure it's reliable. And just as it could contribute to degradation, if there's good procurement principles, it could contribute to forest management. That's why we got into the biomass industry in the first place. But it won't do that unless there's good procurement principles that if it's meant to be a climate solution, that the forest is managed as such, and that there's a way to measure that and validate that it's occurring. It could increase value for landowners and contractors. Typically, we try to buy what can't be sold. And so when we go into a region to develop a facility, we generally look at, well, what isn't there a market for in the region that if there was a market for, maybe we could make some forest improvement treatments feasible. It allows communities to produce their energy locally, so consuming local fuels instead of importing our fuels from overseas or down south. And then the local economic benefit. So we try to source about no further than 100 kilometers from our boiler if we can. The biggest cost and the biggest emissions from biomass energy is the transportation. And so it's a big win-win. It lets more money flow back to the forest if we can keep it close. And then it's one of the renewable energy options along with geothermal, wind, and solar. It holds its own place really for dispatchable winter peaking. That's where biomass is really strong when comparing to other renewables. This is kind of just like to further my point. That we're not the only biomass company out there. We're the only ones that are in it as a vehicle to restore forests. And so, but our chip, unfortunately, when it shows up to a facility, doesn't look any different than a chip that's degraded. And so, we can tell our story and take people to the forest where we can drag people out there and show them. But there's not, when you look at that cubic meter of wood chips, they both have the same energy content. They both displace the same amount of CO2 at the stack. But one may have come from inappropriate harvesting and degraded the forest, and maybe as a result of that created a significant carbon debt in the forest. Whereas the other one could have just been dead or dying fir that was thinned out of the sand, and the trees that were retained were climate resilient and now released to grow quicker. And so what we struggle with is a process or a tool or a way that we can account for that ecological value. So when compared to maybe the average market chip, we're trying to figure out a way to measure the deficit, the ecological deficit of a chip that came from degraded forestry, so that we can measure the full cost in biomass. And maybe this is a good place to pass it over to Kari.
Sure, thanks, Shawn. So maybe, can you go back to that slide for a second? Sure. So this is, yeah, I'll pick up at this point because, and I think this is relevant, the part of the project, so this pilot project that I'm going to talk about is exactly this. How do we tell, those chips look exactly the same. If somebody's going to buy them, how do we guarantee them that they came from the ones on the right side, not the left side? And what does it mean to somebody that it came from the bag on the right side, not the left side? Yeah, okay, go ahead. Okay, so I guess this we're calling it a tracking and traceability project. Essentially what it is kind of a proof of concept around trying to do those things. So you heard Shawn mention that the Bridgewater plant, or the Bridgewater facility, that's part of it. There's a harvesting job that actually Family Forest Network is working on that's applying to there. So we wanted to take that situation and basically try to develop a tool and a dashboard to achieve those results, right? So we want to give the purchaser visibility on where the biomass is coming from and what the ecological profile, whatever that is, we need to figure that out, but that needs to be part of conveying that value. Also, so from the perspective of somebody, so imagine somebody, you're heating this building, you want to know where that energy source is coming from. It's not like you can turn on, order a load of oil, right? It's very different. You need to have some certainty that your supply chain is available and what the moisture contents are and all those types of things. So how can we give visibility to that? We want to be able to provide information on the forest conditions of where the energy is coming from. So I think, so if you can imagine this facility, right? So let's suppose that they're heating with biomass currently. This sort of vision of where we're going with this is you walk in the lobby and there's a dashboard there and it's telling you, we're heating today with wood that came from this location and these are the forest conditions and this is how it was treated and this is where it came from and this is the carbon footprint. All of that information is there available, traced back to the forest where it came from. Verifiable. The hard part, you know, we need to do this in a way that it actually, we can't just throw a bunch of data at people. We need to be able to convey the information in a way that's understood, right? That's kind of where we're at right now. Why to do that? Yeah, adding value to the biomass produced. So if you're doing these things, if you're producing it in an ecologically appropriate way, there's no doubt it's going to cost you more money. So how do we capture that value, right? This is one way to do it, is being able to assure that and provide that sort of digital supply chain along the way. Yeah, maybe go to the next one. So to talk about the project itself, so this was, it's actually funded through NSCC. Some of you are probably aware of the Forest Innovation Funding Program. ACFOR submitted a proposal, was approved, and moving forward with that. As I mentioned, it's the ACFOR providing the Bridgewater NSCC campus. That's sort of the demonstration site for it. The location of the wood for this that we're tracking is a family forest network harvest job in Barrs Corner, just outside. Data capture, so we've got pre-harvest, actual site conditions, surveys and so on that were done there by Family Forest Network and by us. There'll be post-harvest data capture as well. Then there's also production and delivery. So as you'll see in a moment, we need to track through the supply chain where all of this wood is at any given time. And to do that, we're going to be using production and delivery information. And then consumption. So wood comes in, wood gets burnt. How does that balance? Where do we show the overall balance from that? So that's sort of the sources of data related to that. I don't think there's anything here that I didn't cover. That little dot, that's where the harvest site is. It's sort of a mixed wood site. It's currently still going on, so I think it started in January, still ongoing. We've got sort of, not completion data, but you'll see some sort of partial completion data that we're using to demonstrate some of the things that we're doing and testing the systems. Family Forest Network site, yeah, all good. So, yeah, this is just a bunch of pictures. So here's the site. Those polygons that you're seeing, it's sort of a mixed wood type stand. Those are all being treated. They're partial harvest, restoration focused treatments, targeting sort of lower value and species that don't add as much carbon or climate value and ecological value to the forest. This was from a week ago, I guess. Yeah, last week. This is an area that's been completed. So this is what the job looks like when it's done. It's about a 30 or 40% removal. Go ahead, think more. Here's a forwarding trail through it. Really great job. Looked really good. There's some biomass produced on the side of the road. What else we got? There's saw logs produced. There's my dog Penny scaling some logs. Yeah, that's sort of to give you an overview of what the site looks like. Go ahead, Andrew. So getting into the data, a lot of the data that we're using, this is where I get excited. So this is LiDAR derived stuff. So the picture on the top, the image on the top is pre-harvest. The one on the bottom is post-harvest for that specific area. Unfortunately, we need so there's a whole leaf on, leaf off thing, which doesn't give us great results, but you can definitely see the difference. So essentially it's change detection between one image and the next that tells us how much is left, what species, where was it targeted, and so on. So actually it's a really good way of monitoring progress of the job as we're going. There's pre-harvest actual physically taking plots there. There'll also be post-harvest plots, and then as I mentioned earlier, transportation and production records. The majority of what I'm going to focus on for the next little bit, I'll try not to get too geeked out on it, but essentially it's more around the ecological side. The production and tracking, that's a whole other thing. We'll talk about it for a moment to give you a sense of what that means, and then we'll jump into more of the ecological side. Okay, so this is trying to depict, so if you can imagine you've got wood in the forest, how do you know when you burn it, where it came from? Like, how are you able to actually separate it and track it all the way through the system? So this is my attempt to try and demonstrate that. So the way ACFOR is doing it, so they've got a treatment, they've got, let's call it a job number 2531. It's some harvest out there like the one that we're talking about. There may be many of those going on around the forest that are supplying one or many other biomass using facilities. From that forest, the way they do it is so it's divided into hardwood and softwood biomass. So each one of those gets a tracking number, depending on which one it is. It's piled separately in the forest. That gets transported. When it gets transported, it's getting a load number, and that load number gets associated with that tracking number. It gets stored. When it's in storage, it's piled separately, still associated with that same tracking number, so we can still work backwards. It gets chipped. When it's chipped, it goes into separate piles. So as you can see, those of you familiar with forest operations, we're accumulating a fair bit of cost in order to keep all of these separate as we're going, right? It's not insignificant to do that. But the value that is derived from it, hopefully, is worth it, because at the end of the day, when that biomass unit is using that particular pile, even though it's a year and a half later potentially, it can be tracked back to the forest where it came from and what specifically happened there. That's sort of the whole idea. All of that information, this is an example of this, the trace ID 1 versus 2, right? So we've got all of this wood came from the same place, same forest job. The stuff on the left is softwood, the stuff on the right is the hardwood. It's separated in the pile by sort of cross pieces there to keep them separate. The reason that the softwood and hardwood is separated is because of different BTU values and drying regimes and so on, right? So when you're trying to predict how much energy is in the pile, how long it's going to take to dry it, etc., you need to know whether it's softwood or hardwood. That's why it's separated. Okay, so these are sort of examples. Don't worry too much about it. But what we're trying to get at is what types of things can we measure about the ecological footprint of the operation that we can provide to somebody who's purchasing the biomass or who's visiting a facility using it or other stakeholders that are involved in it, right? So what can we do to provide, to demonstrate that the forest operations that produce that biomass are actively working to improve the integrity of the forest. So the approach we're working with right now is to compare different scenarios. So actually the one here, we've got 3 different scenarios. No treatment, the one on the top right, and you'll see this as we look at other graphs as well. That's, okay, what would the forest look like if we didn't do anything, if we just let it grow for the next 20 years? Bottom left, sorry. This is what actually happened. So partial harvest went in, and there's some changes. I'll talk about the changes in a moment. And then the third comparison, top left, is what would the forest look like had we clear cut that, right? So this is a forecast. Take the current conditions, forecast it out over 20 years, look at the results. This particular one, this is getting at species proportion. So what we want to do is kind of increase the proportion of species that are appropriate for the site and reduce the proportion of species that are inappropriate for the site. So it's hard to tell from this, but essentially because of the way it was harvested, there's less balsam fir on the site, there's less white spruce proportionally on the site, there's more red maple on the site. Unfortunately, we didn't have a lot in the data that we have. We don't have really long living, we don't have red sugar maple, yellow birch, those types of things. The best we can do is red maple, but it does show that based on the harvest that happened there, that did increase, and it's going to increase over time. If we go to the next one, Andrew. So this one is total volume on the site. So 2025, all 3 scenarios, they're at, I think it was like 180, 190 cubic meters per hectare. The 3 scenarios again, so the orange one is what actually happened, and then a forecast of what will happen over the next 20 years. The top one, the dark blue, that's what would happen if we didn't do anything. The bottom blue is what would happen if it had been clear cut. Again, these are just, so we're at the process, we've got this data, we're playing around with it, we're trying to find ways to convey the message. Not only convey the message, but also measure for ourselves, have we done the right thing and how do we convey information about whether we have or not. So these are sort of examples around that. So the next one. Proportion of the stand that's long-lived lit species. So again, the orange one, they all scenarios start at 23%, something like that. By doing the treatment and targeting certain species, we've increased the proportion of sort of appropriate species for the site in proportion to the total versus what would have been there naturally, or obviously what would happen if we'd done a clear cut. Carbon stored on site. So this one, again, they all start at the same point. Obviously, if we do no treatment, there's going to be more carbon stored on the site. We know that, we recognize that, we need to account for that. But the question is, if we do the treatment, how long does it take to get back to the point where we've got the same amount stored on the site? In this case, it's about 20 years, I think, is what we're doing to. So again, carbon stored on the site. Orange is what happened in the first year, that drop down by about 30%, and then what's expected to happen based on forecasting. Top blue line is what would have happened had we done that. Other things that we want to measure or thinking about working on, So percent lake zero, we talked about that, carbon recovery years. I think that's a great measure, but how do you convey that easily on a dashboard? That's something we need to figure out. Same with carbon stored. Crown closure. So before we did the treatment, it was about 98%. After we did the treatment, it was about 60% crown closure. Other things that we think are important, local economic impact. So as Shawn mentioned, you know, we're displacing oil, we're displacing natural gas and propane is brought in from the States. How do we measure that? How do we convey that information? Carbon emissions, so the reduction of non-renewables. Carbon life cycle analysis, so not just how much carbon is stored, but if you look at the whole picture, what is the net effect on carbon in the atmosphere based on what we've done here. So a bunch of things, there's still a lot of work to do, but essentially the vision is to take this information and be able to display it. As you can imagine, you walk in the lobby and there's a dashboard there and it says, we're heating today, it's this many BTUs and this is where it came from and this is the impact. That's the vision. Okay, so I went through that pretty quick. We can go back if there's more questions, but maybe just go ahead. Just some other thoughts around that. And some of this Shawn has covered, maybe I'm repeating some of that stuff, but I'm going to put my own take on it, I guess. So is there an opportunity, specifically around woodlot owners? That's kind of always been my focus. So what is the opportunity there around biomass potentially for woodlot owners? The biggest piece for me is this graph. So this is data I stole from Bria and Pete. This is prescribed treatments on FSC woodlots in eastern Nova Scotia, total hectares by clear-cut, restoration type activities, and silviculture. The clear-cut ones, they're economically feasible and we can get them done, oftentimes, right? We can usually, unless it's a small area, if there's enough volume there, you can find a contractor to come and do that because it's economically viable. The restoration harvest, which is more than double the amount in terms of area, it's very hard to get those done because there's no market for the products produced. If we want to do some type of treatment which, you know, restores forest or removes climate risk species, all of those types of things, it's not financially viable to do it because there's no market. And hopefully, if done properly, this might provide that opportunity. Go ahead. One thing I think we take this for granted, but if you stop and think about it, it's quite different here in the Maritimes than even the rest of Canada. So here we live very close to the forest. So if you think about how far you are away from forest activities at any one time, we're never that far away. If you think about somebody in Southern Ontario or in Vancouver, they're hundreds and hundreds of miles away from where those forest management or forestry activities happen. So the forest here is distributed equally across the province, and so is the demand, right? It's not only big cities that are far away from the forest. I think, like Shawn is mentioning, there's an opportunity to source energy close to the actual place that we're going to be consuming it. So I think that's a big one. Reducing transportation and emissions associated with that. Our grid is already at full capacity, so this is kind of along the same lines. It just makes sense to produce the energy where you're actually going to use it and not be relying on the grid, not putting more energy on the grid, which is already over capacity. Energy, just want to go back one second. I just want to see what else I've missed. Energy sovereignty, yeah, so Shawn mentioned this one. I mean, we're currently importing propane and natural gas and exporting low-value wood. We're losing on both ends, right? Why does that make sense? Surely there's something better we can do there. Yeah, go ahead, Andrew. That's good. Okay, this is the last slide, I promise. So, a few things to think about here. So, if we were to pay $140 a ton for wood that's 35% moisture at a source, $140 a ton is pretty darn good for low-value wood. That's equivalent to 6 cents per kilowatt hour. So if you think about your own energy bill, right, there's room there to do some creative things. There's room, we think, to take some of that and apply it to actually doing restorative type treatments the way ACFOR is doing. So I think there's opportunity there. I think, and I hope, and I think we all need to make sure new projects will require some type of sustainable forest practices, right? That if you're looking to market clean energy or claim clean energy, there needs to be a requirement that it comes from sustainable forest practices. There's no doubt about that. The other interesting thing that I hadn't really thought about around biomass, but have another sort of forest sector things in Nova Scotia. So if you're going to invest in some new facility and you go to a bank, you're going to need some way of assuring that you've got enough supply. And in Nova Scotia, that supply comes from private woodlot owners. And the problem we've always faced in the past is that it's disaggregated. If I want to build a sawmill, I can't go to 2,000 different woodlot owners and sign a contract with them. It's just not feasible to do that. So oftentimes we're limited to those types of investment based on what type of wood supply we can get from Crown land. Crown land is already over allocated, but there's opportunity on private land. I think there's a large appetite on private from woodlot owners who want to do the right thing to potentially provide a source for these projects. Now, how do we tie those two things together, right? So the larger project that I was talking about working with ACFOR, that's kind of what we're talking about now. So how do we make sure it's done right? How do we make sure that those margins go towards forest operations and restorative forestry? And how do we actually take the supply investment with the development of the project so that they can benefit from that? Don't have answers, stuff we're thinking about. I think that is the last slide, isn't it?
Yep.
Okay.